Welcome back to the Unemployment Insurance Study Committee. It is still November 18th. We're on the second half of our morning session. And we are going to talk about a series of options that we have before us in order to correct some of the both legislative intent and ability to enact legislation that we passed last session, which was Act number
51.
51. I really should know that. Thank you. And so Joyce is going to start us off, taking us through the various scenarios that we have come up with.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Joyce Manchester from the Joint Fiscal Office. And I'm going to share my screen. Perhaps. Did you get some information?
You were listed as a co-host.
Okay. Okay, I'm having trouble. Let's see.
We can also follow along.
Or I can bring it up.
Sure, if you could bring it up, that might be the best thing to do. Apologize for the delay.
Fine. Technology never works.
Joyce.
the way it's supposed to.
You gotta mute yourself, or we're gonna get feedback.
No, I didn't join.
You're right.
You are. I know I joined, but I did not say use computer audio. So it should be.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's such a good idea.
Yeah. That's great. If you can go into presentation mode or whatever, so we don't see the whole. If you're in, oh, you're on the PDF, aren't you? Okay, I think we can live with this, yes? Okay, good, thank you very much. So I have done a little bit of work in terms of three options to pay out an additional $10 million per year to recipients for 10 years. And just to give a bit of context, you'll recall that in the spring, Act 51 essentially offered $100 million of contribution relief to employers. And the idea was to also try to offer $100 million in more benefits to recipients over a period of 10 years. So we are thinking of three different ways, actually four different ways, but one is purely legal. So I'm going to concentrate on three different ways to possibly pay out an extra $10 million per year. So yes, the first one would be to raise the maximum benefit. And this is seen as a short-term solution before we have a modernized UI program available to us. So this would be for 3 or 4 or 5 years. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. The second idea is to raise the reimbursement percentage. So you'll remember that right now, Vermont pays about 58% of a person's average weekly wage in their unemployment insurance benefit. And this would raise the reimbursement percentage modeled to 70%, just as an illustration. And thirdly, we could possibly create a special fund separate from the UI trust fund. So the idea would be that employers would still pay the same amount of contributions to the UI system, but that we would reduce either the tax rate schedule or the taxable wage base amount, so that the amount that goes into the UI trust fund would be determined by that tax rate schedule or the taxable wage base amount. And then we would levy a fee on employers to make up the difference to get them back to the same amount of contributions. And that special fee would go into a new special fund that could then pay out an additional benefit, or it could support more modernization, or it could be used for other purposes. Are there questions there? That's just the general setting the table. Okay, so let's first talk about raising the maximum unemployment insurance benefit amount. And again, this is meant to be illustrative and it would be only a short-term solution. So I first started with a little table here that will show you the maximum weekly benefit amount in recent years. So the maximum benefit amount is set to change in July. It's in the middle of the calendar year. And that's because we need data on the state average weekly wage from the prior calendar year in order to set the new maximum weekly benefit. So in January of 2019, the maximum benefit was $506. In July of that year, it increased to $513. You can see in my lines below that the percentage change in the state average weekly wage for all workers, and this isn't exactly what's used to set the change in the maximum weekly benefit, but it's pretty close. Side note, what's left out when you actually set the change in the maximum weekly benefit are the federal workers, because they're not covered by the state UI system. So this percentage change that I've shown you is for all workers, 3.6%. It turns out that it was 3.5% once you omit the federal workers. So the weekly wage increased, the maximum benefit increased by 3.5% to $513. Then we moved to 2020. In July of that year, the benefit was increased to $531. That remained in place until July of this year, when the maximum benefit increased to $583. That was a pretty big jump, and that's because the state average weekly wage increased by 9.8%. So that's how currently the maximum weekly benefit amount changes, and certainly it will continue to rise in future years because we will continue to see increases in the average weekly wage. So what I've done is I've looked at the maximum benefit in 2020, the second half of 2020, which is $531. And I've used that distribution of unemployment benefits. Yes, could you please go to the next slide? Yeah. And I've used the distribution of unemployment benefits per week that I've shown you in the past. I showed you last meeting. And I've estimated a rough cost of $7.5 million, moving up to $725 for the maximum. Now, I had a really good conversation with Matt Barowitz of the Department of Labor yesterday, and he and I went at this exercise very differently, and it's possible that I may need to revise some of my assumptions about how 2022 might compare to 2020. So I have to think about how many people will be on the system in 2022. I'm trying to use data from 2020, so you can see it's really important to get that ratio right. And I may not have taken all the data into account. The big problem is that I have initial benefits by numbers of people and by amounts, but I don't know how many weeks each of those people stayed on the system, the duration of their benefits. And so that's going to very much influence the average weekly benefit paid out and my cost of raising this maximum benefit. It looks, from preliminary analysis, it looks like people with somewhat higher benefits, weekly benefits, stay on the system a little bit longer. Because what we're finding is that the average weekly benefit actually paid out is bigger than the average initial benefit, which seems counterintuitive to me, but it could be true if people with higher benefits stay on the system longer. So anyway, so this is all to say that these dollar amounts are all very rough, but they'll give you an idea. And certainly if we were to model this next year, we would have different data and we would come up with different estimates. Okay, so Here's the picture of the distribution of initial weekly UI benefits. Here I'm showing you that about 30% of recipients were eligible for $300 or less per week. The maximum weekly benefit actually for the second half of 2020 was still coded as $506. So you've got that big sharp increase of $506. In fact, the actual maximum benefit was $531. Okay, so that just creates another little modeling issue, but that's what the distribution of benefits looked like second half of 2020. We could go to the next slide. So my exercise here was to raise the maximum benefit so that all the people who were receiving a capped amount at $506 increased to $531 would be able to earn their actual calculated benefit until we got all the way up to $725, at which point they would be capped. So the other important assumption here is that I used about 45% of the benefit amounts paid out in the second half of 2020 to estimate how much might be paid out in 2022. That assumption may have to change depending on future conversations with Matt Barowitz. Okay, so just to put this $725 in context, a weekly UI benefit of $725 in 2020 corresponded to a weekly wage of about $1,254, which means a full year annual earnings of about $65,000. The Vermont median household income in 2019 was about $63,000. We don't yet have 2020, but it'll be a bit higher. So you can see that UI benefit for this group at 725 would target about the median household income, not a single person income, but the household income. So that's something to keep in mind. And as I said, we should have data on median household income in 2020 soon, in November. In December next month. Are there questions about that exercise, raising the maximum benefit?
So by raising the maximum weekly benefit, it raises the average. But
Yeah.
it's really the higher earners that are earning it. It doesn't filter down to the
Exactly.
lower wage income.
Exactly right. And the reason that we are looking at raising the maximum is that it's one feasible change that could be made to the UI system, to the mainframe system.
Yeah, but we're leaving out the people that really need it the most.
Absolutely. Exactly right.
Not that everybody doesn't need it.
True.
There are the lower wage earners, the ones that are really struggling. Thank you.
Yes.
But it is about a third of the recipients, right?
Let's see, we saw that 34% were at 506, which was the old maximum benefit. So it'd be a little bit less than a third by the time you get to 531, which is the actual maximum benefit. Yeah, but all those folks above would be impacted, right? Shall we go on?
I think we shall.
All right. So the second idea would be to raise the reimbursement percentage. And remember, this is not something that we're considering for the short term. This would only be possible after a modernized system is in place. So we're looking down the road here. So the way that the reimbursement percentage is calculated now is that you look at a person's earnings from their two highest earning quarters and divide that total amount, the 6 month amount of earnings, by 45. Okay, and we come to this reimbursement percentage, which is currently 57.8%. So just to illustrate this, consider a person who earns $40,000 a year, $20,000 in the two highest quarters. So here I'm assuming smooth earnings across the year, and we know that's not always true, but for illustrative purposes, this is an easy example. So we would divide 20,000 by 45 to get the UI weekly benefit amount of $444.44. You can look at the weekly earnings by dividing 40,000 by 52, and we get $769.23. And so we find out that the UI weekly benefit amount is indeed 57.8% of the weekly earnings amount. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, now the question was, what happens if we consider raising the reimbursement percentage to 70%? And again, this is an illustration. This is not necessarily what the committee may decide on. So JFO, that would be me, finds that dividing earnings in the two highest quarters by 37 would raise the reimbursement percentage to 70.3%. And this is about as close as we can come to 70% with a whole number divisor. So that means that we would be raising the reimbursement percentage from 57.8 to 70.3. That's an increase of 21.6%, so a little over a fifth increase in UI benefits. And this would be across the board, of course, because everybody would get that increase. So just to illustrate from the point of view of the system, how much would it cost the UI system to pay out the extra benefit? The overall cost of UI benefits was $814,000 during the week ending November. I think that's a typo. I think it should be November 6th. So if the reimbursement rate had been 70%, the cost would have been about $990,000. So that is a sizable increase in the overall cost. But on the benefit side, we can also think about a weekly benefit amount of about $380. That's close to the average weekly benefit from UI. And that benefit, $380, would increase to $462. So the question next might be, is it possible or feasible to raise the reimbursement percentage? And of course, the answer is it's not really feasible until we get that modernized UI system in place. And now I just want to mention again the idea of induced entry, because certainly a higher UI benefit could cause workers to either, so these would be unemployed workers who previously might have decided not to apply. So they might decide to apply, more might decide to apply. Some people on the UI program might decide to stay on longer, to search longer for the right job for them. And some people might decide not to really search hard for a job until their time on unemployment insurance is up, if they find that the 70% reimbursement rate is working for their family or whatever. So these are just possible effects. And you'll remember a month ago, I talked about only weak support, very weak support for induced entry when a researcher looked at the effect of the extra $600 benefit from the CARES Act, the FPUC benefit. So in that case, very weak support was evident, if any. But there is a difference here in that $600 benefit was known to be temporary. It was known from the start that it was only in place from April through July 25th of 2020. So people would look at that differently than they would a permanent increase in UI benefits. So, okay, any questions about raising the maximum?
So, well, I think to your point too,
We're talking about raising the reimbursement percentage. Yes, thank you.
the $600, I think it's from that time period, people couldn't find a job anyway. And so there wasn't a real reason for someone to be out, and we suspended job searching. So.
Right, different situation.
But when we talk about percentages over a fixed amount, we're still in the same category that a higher wage earner is going to do better than a lower wage earner.
In dollar
Yeah.
numbers, that's true. In percentage terms, everyone gets the same percentage. Right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. So if we had set like we did in Act 51, it was a straight across the board $25 to everyone. Everyone was treated equally at that point.
Yes.
I imagine that if we decided to walk down this path among our 5 paths, that there would be space to start talking about brackets and progressive ways of doing that, and then we have a long runway to figure that out, given the UI modernization process.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to the third idea, which is to establish a separate fee to fund the special fund and possibly additional benefits. So again, this is a long-term idea. So as I mentioned earlier, the notion here is to maintain the same level of employer contributions to UI, but to split them out so that part would go into the trust fund and another piece would go into this special fund. So the exercise here is to try to reduce contributions paid to the trust fund about $10 million a year. There are 2 ways that this could be done sort of outside the mainframe system right now. It could be done within a modernized system in the future. I should retract my statement. I don't want to imply that it could be done now outside the mainframe because we don't want to monkey with all of this stuff. But so the 2 straightforward ways to do it would be to lower the tax rate schedule. So right now, there are regulations in place that say when the trust fund is of a certain ratio relative to benefits paid out, the tax rate schedule is determined. So you remember that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 tax rate schedules. And this could say, okay, under the regulations, the tax rate schedule would be, for example, 3. And instead, the legislature could decide that the tax rate schedule would be 1 less than determined under current regulations. So that's one idea. A second would be to lower the taxable wage amount. So remember, right now, UI taxes are only imposed on the first $14,100 of earnings. That's expected to go up in January. We don't know how much yet, but let's say that it's scheduled to go up to $14,600, okay? And the legislature could say, all right, that's what would be determined, but we want the taxable wage amount to be less than that by a certain amount, okay? All right, so the new fee would be imposed so that employers are paying the same amount. The new fee would go into this special fund, and then the special fund could be used to pay out additional benefits or whatever. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've now just talked through what's on my slide here, except that I have numbers to assign as well. So if the tax rate schedule would have been at level 3, this new change that could be imposed by the legislature could say, instead of level 3, we're going to make it level 2 for the tax rate schedule. If that's true, my estimate is that contributions would be about 18.4 million less per year. So that's for each 1 notch in the tax rate schedule. Now that's more than 10 million, which was my goal, but you could imagine that this scheme would be in place for maybe 5 or 6 years instead of 10 years, and benefits could be paid out over whatever period of time you like. So that's how it works with the tax rate schedule. Secondly, my rough estimate says that if we reduce the taxable wage amount by $1,500, contributions would be about 9 million less per year. So that's not too far off from my goal. So again, if the taxable wage amount would have been $14,600, now under this new scheme, it would be about $13,100, and UI taxes on the difference on the $1,500 would be funneled into that special fund. So that's the way that the special fund would work. It's a little bit complicated to know if the UI system could handle that special fund and pulling off the contributions before they get to the trust fund. The tricky part is that once any contributions go to the UI trust fund, they cannot be used for anything other than approved UI benefits. So you have to really get them onto the system before they hit the trust fund. That's the key. Is that the end of the slideshow? Yes, excellent. All right, are there questions about that one?
We did lose Senator Sharpton, but maybe he'll find his way back to us. Any questions? Anyone?
Questions, but not for.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Joyce.
Thank you.
And then Damien, you had sort of the final option for us. I don't mean that to sound so doomsday, sorry. What? Yeah, so far from the.
Morning again. I'm not sure how I feel about the labels given to the options I'm about to present to the committee. So what I'm doing essentially is putting what Joyce just presented to you in legislative language. So the first is something that we have had lengthy discussions over how this is essentially not possible to do within the constraints of the current mainframe. So I don't want to revisit that, but I think it's good to just kind of ground us. And this is the option that was presented to us by USDOL, which is incorporating the $25 additional that we had put into Act 51 into the weekly benefit amount, instead of adding it at the end as a supplement in place of the FPUC program. So this would allow us to use trust fund dollars to pay that amount. And it would add it to the calculation. So let me share my screen here and I'll just orient everyone to the language. So if we're looking at line 8 here, we're saying and adding $25 to the resulting quotient. So we basically take our 2 pi quarters, we divide by 45, that gives you, let's say $150, and then you add $25 to that quotient.
Is this, excuse me, but is this from the, I found it.
It's from today's handout.
Page document there?
Yes.
Yep, and it's page 7 of today's handout.
Thank you.
Again, this is something that, while theoretically it's possible to do within the mainframe system, the potential for catastrophic consequences is very high. And we've had discussions with ADS and the department about those challenges. Lines 12 through 15, just strike the language that was in Act 51, adding the $25 benefit. Subdivision F1, which was intended to just simply say that the maximum weekly benefit would be $25 above where it would otherwise be. In talking to Director Wood this morning, it's become clear that this language might need to be refined to avoid an unintended consequence of inadvertently adding $50 to people's benefits instead of adding 25, or turning this into a cumulative calculation instead of annually. Your max benefit is 57% of the state average weekly wage plus $25 instead of adding $25 each year to that amount and gradually growing. So that being said, this is also something that is unlikely to move forward unless we can find a way to work through the mainframe system.
So can I comment on? So
Yeah.
I think the way I think of this is that this is a tweak in our legislative intent language. And then the mechanism for fulfilling that legislative intent is that then becomes the question of whether or not it's compliant with federal law or not. But the legislative intent is now in compliance with federal rule. And I think that's sort of the difference in this. It does feel in some ways like a little bit more of a nuclear option.
Well, yeah, when we did meet with USDOL, if I remember correctly, they said that provided we had a fix going down the road that we could implement. And so does that mean that we could use the same system that we use to get the PUA dollars out to self-employed and all that until we have a mainframe that can support what we want to do?
So the challenge with this is the addressing, and I don't want to speak for the department, but to paraphrase my understanding of the challenge is that, yes, we could have use this language to clarify the legislative intent, and USDOL did indicate that we could implement this provided we were able to come into conformance. The issue is the timeline for coming into conformance. And so if we can't update the mainframe in a very short period of time, then in order to be in conformance, we're requiring our Vermont DOL to manually make the adjustments to people's benefits, to employers' experience ratings, to reimbursable employers' bills, to partial unemployment offsets, et cetera. And so if you're talking about, a few thousand claims a week, those are a few thousand claims a week where they have to retroactively tweak the information. The potential possibility here is if we are able to find some way to get the mainframe fixed fairly quickly, potentially you could do this. But if we can't fix the mainframe, then we're talking about indefinitely requiring our own state DOL to manually make all of these changes with all of the potential for additional errors that comes with that. So that's the issue at heart here is USDOL would be open to something where we can come into conformance. But the timeline for doing that and how we actually do that are both difficult. And for employers' tax purposes, you need to get these benefits squared away with their experience rating charges before the end of the calendar year, because otherwise when the department goes to do those calculations, you're going to start seeing problems, particularly if this is only implemented for part of the year, because then anyone who paid benefits in the part of the year where this is implemented is going to need to have an adjustment made so that their experience rating is correct in the following year.
Senator Strachan, we're on page 7 of the cluster of legislation that Damien has in one document up on that page.
Thank you. I apologize. I had to deal with a medical issue, but I'm back.
Great, thank you.
So the other language here going on to page 8 is simply deleting sunset language from Act 51. So if we did this, we would need to also address that. So we didn't inadvertently revert our law to a prior state of affairs that we didn't intend. But we may need to adopt additional new sunset language if this $25 increase was meant to be temporary. So I've just shown a repealer here because if we did this, I imagine there would be a variety of other changes, maybe a delayed effective date, maybe some changes in how we do the sunset and so forth. Questions on that? Okay. The next option is the payment through the separate fund that Joyce highlighted. I have not drafted the changes to the maximum weekly benefit. But that's something that would be, that's the easiest thing to draft here is, particularly if we figure out a dollar amount that we want to start from, we figure out the percentage of the state average weekly wage, and then we would substitute that in. Of course, the administration of that is more complicated than the drafting, but I haven't drafted that out. For the benefit paid through the supplemental or the separate fund, the first thing we add is on page 9, lines 13 to 15. Again, this is clarifying the legislative intent. Our original intent was that the supplemental benefit would be paid with trust fund dollars. This is saying shall be paid from the unemployment insurance supplemental special fund. It is a clunky name. Of course, we could change that in drafting. And it's worth noting for the coming sections that what I've actually done is resurrected a supplemental surcharge and supplemental special fund that we created in 1989 because of a potential federal decrease in funding for work training. And it was designed to keep that funding going during that period. It sunset shortly thereafter. I don't know that it ever took effect because there were a number of sort of contingencies in the enacting language that needed to be met for it to kick in. And frankly, I was 9 years old then, so I just wasn't tracking these things. So, I was sorry. I was a lot more concerned about, you know, who was starting shortstop for the Red Sox then. So the next language here is this is the replacing the repealer language from, or the sunset language from Act 51. The only update here is adding in the deletion of the language that we just added in the previous section. The next section is the new supplemental contribution. It's section 1321A, which was repealed in 1990 or 1991. And this would reenact it using actually very similar language to our previous contribution. And it provides that employers liable for contributions pursuant to section 1321, which is the section setting out contributions and taxable wage base, shall pay an additional contribution of blank percent of the wages paid for employment at the same time and in the same manner as contributions pursuant to that subsection. The supplemental contributions would be deposited into the supplemental special fund that we're establishing and could only be used for the purposes authorized pursuant to that section. And then subdivision 3 on lines 19 and 20 would provide that sections 1329 to 1332 and section 1336 would apply. These are the sections for what happens if an employer either contests the amount of their contribution or fails to pay it. So this is allowing employers to appeal the assessment from the department and also allowing the department to collect unpaid contributions. And then we use the same definition of wages as in section 1321. And the reason we do that is that ties us to the taxable wage base. So this contribution would be paid on the same exact taxable wage base to hopefully simplify collection. The next change to 1334 is just adding a reference to this supplemental special fund. And this again relates to the collection of unpaid contributions. The only reason this wasn't included in the previous cross-reference is because there's no reference to that special fund. So a strict reading of the statute, there'd be no mechanism to deposit the money that should be going to the special fund into the special fund. So this is just dotting I's and crossing T's. On line 10 of page 11, we get to the new supplemental special fund. And the receipts that fund the fund would be from section 1321A. The provision here provides that it would be used to pay the supplemental benefit created and to pay any costs associated with the administration of that benefit and of the fund. And this is on the understanding that, as Director Wood mentioned earlier today, while DOL does provide administrative dollars, they're insufficient. And although DOL has indicated that administrative dollars could potentially be used to pay for the administration of something like this, because they're already not providing enough, we would need to provide for the administrative costs here. So this would allow that to happen. This would also direct interest earned on the fund balances to be credited to the fund. And there are two things I've highlighted in yellow here. First is, would there be any additional purposes? The reason I've highlighted this is other states that have some sort of surcharge or special fund set up often allow use for purposes such as IT modernization, workforce training initiatives, enforcement costs, etc. So there are a number of things that, depending on how we structure the surcharge and the amount of money coming in, you could designate a portion of this to be used for those purposes. And you could also say subject to appropriation. Basically mean that each year the department would come in and say, our projected benefit costs are X, we'd like to use the remainder for Y, and it could be a special purpose each year, or it could be a narrow group of purposes that we then appropriate for each year.
Don't other states also sometimes use this fund as a way of like almost an insurance package in case their trust fund gets too low?
Yeah, that's another option, is to put in language that would provide that in the event the trust fund dropped below a certain threshold, you could pay a certain percentage or all of this amount into the trust fund to bolster that. Particularly if you were going to pay a significant portion of the fund in, you would want to marry that to language that suspended the additional benefit in that instance, so that you weren't robbing Peter to pay Paul.
And then it's also, I remember you saying something about using it to pay interest on federal.
Right, that's another thing that other states use some of their special funds for, is as a reserve to pay interest on federal loans or to pay back federal loans, so that you don't have to use general fund dollars for those purposes. The next highlighted language on lines 21 and 22 would allow the commissioner to seek and accept grants from any source for deposit into the fund. And this goes along with the idea of being able to potentially use the fund for things like IT modernization. So in that instance, the commissioner can pursue grant funding for that project and add it to the funds to then be used for that purpose. It's also worth noting that there's nothing that ties us to a single special fund. So you could very easily have the same surcharge and split the proceeds into multiple funds, each with a dedicated purpose, so that you don't have to get into the annual situation of, for example, saying, well, do we have enough to pay benefits and the IT modernization costs? Instead, it's separate funds, and we could appropriate money. Say we're short on IT modernization costs, we could then bring money from the general fund and put it into that special fund without worries about it being drawn down to pay benefits. So I'm getting into the weeds here, but this is just one way of doing it, and there are a number of ways that we could structure this if we did this going forward. And none of this gets to the question of whether we could do this with our current system, resources, etc.
Questions from anyone?
Okay. So the only other two things I wanted to just note on pages 12 and then on page 14, we're I've just highlighted where we would need to either make a change to the taxable wage base or to the ratios for the tax schedule in order to accomplish the reduction in regular UI taxes that Joyce was talking about earlier. It would be probably an either or option, but you could do both. One thing to note with adjusting the ratios is that potentially, unless we simply shifted everything over to the left, so, you know, to be at Schedule 1, you'd have to be 2.0 and over, and then Schedule 2, 1.5 to 1.99 if you're looking at the ratios that I'm looking at here. You run the risk that in some years you don't go to the next schedule lower. So you could have, for example, if we think back to when we removed 2020 from the calculation for tax schedules, some years were one schedule lower, some years were exactly the same schedule, just because those ratios don't necessarily track cleanly from one schedule to the next. So that's something to remember there, whereas taxable wage base is a pretty fixed number. Other questions? Okay,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
I think with that,
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was sharing all this time and I'd taken my share down. So
Oh.
I hope everyone is able to follow.
I actually didn't notice, so
So, okay,
Michael's looking at something, which I think is another screen, so. With that, we are going to take a lunch break and then talk about it all afterwards. With the department, if they're still able to join us after lunch. Thank you.